We're looking in this session at Matthew's Gospel. People like titles. I'm sometimes a bit less keen, but if you want a title for Matthew's Gospel and for this talk, Sermons, Parables, and a Great Commission. Those are things that Matthew majors on: sermons, parables, and a Great Commission. Other Gospels don't omit those things, but they sum Matthew up quite well. Matthew, compared to some of the others, is a longish Gospel. Matthew has some very distinctive features. It's written by a Jew for a largely Jewish audience. So it makes quite a lot of reference to the Old Testament. Time after time, Matthew is keen on pointing out how Jesus is fulfilling prophecies from the Old Testament, even things that weren't thought of as prophecies, just historical events. Jesus is somehow making them real or showing that they were pointing to him. It's a great gospel of fulfillment. It's written for people who knew their Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, reasonably well, or at least knew it a bit, and you could make reference to it and think, oh, all right. So that makes sense. So this isn't a complete break from our Jewish faith. This is a fulfillment. It's a completion. It's the Jewish faith really coming true and getting bigger. That's what Matthew wants his readers to hear. Matthew has a number of blocks of teaching. We're very well aware of the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 to 7, but he equally has long chunks of teaching in chapter 10, and then chapter 13, which is a whole load of parables, then chapter 18, and then the end of chapter 23 through to chapter 25, which is all about what we might call the last things, the end of the world, judgment, etc. So Matthew has those 5 big blocks of teaching, which sets it apart a bit from the others. The others have plenty of teaching in them, but not arranged the same way. Matthew is very strong on, although he's a Jewish gospel, Jewish writer, Jewish audience in mind, trying to show the links between Jewish, what we'd call Old Testament history, and Jesus is the fulfillment of all that. He's quite emphatic that the gospel is for all nations, and that's the wonderful Great Commission at the end of chapter 28, that Jesus is for all, not just for the Jew, and that the gospel is God's promises to the Jews now going out to the whole world. And so it's a gospel that looks at a nation or a people who may have been a bit inward looking on their faith, that we are the chosen people, the blessed ones, etc. And he's saying to them, to his own people, we now look out and we take the good news of Jesus, who fulfills our scriptures, to the whole world, because it's for everyone, not just us. The world is now the chosen people, not just the Jews. It's a slightly Pauline way of saying what Matthew says. Matthew is strong on the theme of kingdom. He's strong on a number of those themes that we see and understand as important. It used to be commonly thought, because it's the first gospel in our Bibles, that Matthew was the first gospel to be written. There are some scholars who still think that. Rather more scholars these days tend to suggest it was Mark that was the first one written. Matthew and Mark have a lot in common. At least almost everything in Mark is in Matthew as well, though Mark is quite a bit shorter. But was the longer one written first and then the shorter one, or the shorter one then the longer one? You can argue either case. It's impossible to prove it. One particular Bible scholar in the 1970s, and a few more since, who've suggested slightly radically that maybe John was the first one. We'll probably never know the answer to that question, at least not this side of eternity. But Matthew is the first that appears in our Bibles. That's all we can say with an absolute certainty. Whether he's starting with Mark and building on it and adding bits that Mark had missed out, or whether he is writing for a different group and a different perspective and in a different way from Mark, could be either. Mark is not, he doesn't focus on the Jewishness of Jesus or the way it all connects with the Old Testament. And he isn't interested in taking a group of people who'd been perhaps inward looking on their faith and saying it's actually for the whole world. That isn't what Mark's about. So we'll leave that dispute to one side, or we'll touch on it perhaps in the sixth talk when we're off the emphasis on each of the Gospels. But Matthew, well, as we go through Matthew, and my aim today isn't to explain Matthew to you, that would be impossible in this sort of length of time. My aim is very much to get you to read Matthew yourself again and again and again, and give you some tips for what he's up to and some perspective on what is a bit different about Matthew, and let you take it for yourself and learn Matthew and love Matthew more and more. I'm assuming, and not everyone does, I'm not quite assuming, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm assuming, I've thought quite a bit about it, and I believe it's true, that Matthew, the one who wrote this, is the one who is referred to the Gospels as Matthew, also known as Levi, the one who had been a tax collector and came to faith in Jesus, and his life was utterly transformed as a result. So as a tax collector, he'd been a servant of the Roman occupying powers, unpopular with the Jews, but as a tax collector, also a relatively powerful and well-off figure. He'd have been reasonably well educated, obviously very good with numbers, but powerful chap. The tax collectors each had a small detachment of soldiers working under them who helped them enforce their collection of taxes. And they didn't just collect the taxes, they were actually able to some degree to set the amount that people had to pay. So it was a role that was hated by the Jewish people because it was taxes for the Roman authorities. But it was a job for someone who was reasonably well educated and was something of a leader, maybe even something of a bully, or a very, very dominant character would need to be a tax collector, even if to some extent he could hide behind the soldiers. He made serious decisions about people's lives, and he changed. And he'd been keeping some of the taxes for himself, as was the system. Rome didn't mind that the tax collectors were corrupt as long as they got their share. And if tax collectors got rich as a result of collecting taxes by taking a bit off the top, as long as Rome got their share, that was the system that worked. And Matthew acknowledged when he came to faith that he needed to pay back some of what he'd taken from his own people. And he changed. Now, for me, Matthew equals Levi is the one who's writing this gospel. He's a successful, prosperous, in charge, educated sort of person within the Jewish world. Unpopular, but politically canny and working with the occupying authorities until he meets Jesus and comes to faith in Jesus. So that's a different background of gospel writer from the others, what we know about them. His style is very Jewish, even though it's well written in Greek. He's an educated man. He writes Greek well and clearly, and it's it's good Greek. There's a lot of Jewish vocabulary in it, not surprisingly, because he's writing from an Old Testament background, and he's writing about Jesus and the events of his life who belong in the Jewish world. But he writes good Greek that reads like good Greek, though with a heavy smattering of Jewish words in it. He also has access to some information that the other gospel writers don't have or don't tell us about. So he gives us his version of the Christmas story, but it's from Joseph's point of view. It's fascinating. The other Christmas story in the Gospels is in Luke, which is very much from Mary's point of view. So I guess where Matthew got his information from was a source to do with Joseph, even if Joseph was dead by the time Jesus' ministry begins, and he isn't talked about other than Jesus being described as the son of Joseph, or the son of the carpenter. There's no sign of Joseph. He isn't evident in the Gospels other than around the birth stories. But Matthew seems to have got information that is Joseph-centered, from Joseph himself or from someone Joseph had talked to. Whereas Luke's account is very much the Mary story and possibly the shepherd story as well. Matthew has the wise men and Joseph, but the wise men story could have come from or through Joseph as well. Fascinating beginning to Matthew's Gospel, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. We're straight into Jewishness there. If you go back to Genesis, you have the genealogy of Noah, which doesn't just mean Noah's ancestry and his successors. It's a heading that means this is the story of Noah, as well as what we'd call genealogy. And with Genesis, you've got the genealogy of Abraham and other characters as well. And Matthew, beginning with an account of the genealogy of Jesus, takes you straight into Old Testament thinking if you are an Old Testament student. But it's Jesus the Messiah, very Jewish word, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew is saying, right, start clearly at the beginning. Jesus is a Jew. He's descended from David, the great king of 1,000 years before. He's descended from Abraham 1,000 years earlier, the founder of the Jewish race or nation. So the two key figures of 2,000 years before and 1,000 years before, Matthew locates Jesus as descendants of them, really thoroughly Jewish. Being a descendant of David doesn't make him immediately royal. I've no idea how many of us are descendants one way or another of William the Conqueror, who's the same sort of distance back in time, not quite as far. There are an awful lot of people who are descendants of William the Conqueror, but it doesn't make them all part of the royal family. Genealogies do many circuitous things over the centuries. But it locates Jesus as very, very Jewish. And then it continues, Matthew 1 verse 2. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And then goes through this long list of 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus, and making a strange point that there's a lot of symbolism in Jewish thinking, especially symbolism of numbers, not least 7 and multiples of 7. Matthew wants us to think that Jesus is that 14 generations from Abraham takes you to David, and 14 generations from David takes you to the destruction of Israel and Judah, the deportation to Babylon, and another 14 generations takes you from the deportation to Babylon to Jesus. So Matthew's seeing a lot of numerical symbolism in all this. He's also, as you look through that list, it's as Jewish genealogies were, just the name of the man. But occasionally you get a woman mentioned, and each time the woman is there for a very good reason. It just makes you sit up and think, because in the women who are mentioned, you get a Gentile like Ruth, you get a prostitute like Rahab, you get others who don't quite belong. Tamar, a very, very unpleasant story of abuse back in Genesis. And the women who are mentioned are there, and it's showing you that although he's of a Jewish genealogy, it isn't, you know, what we might call pure blood, blue blood, you know, fully pedigree Jewish. There's a bit of non-Jew comes in there. That's interesting. And it wasn't all ultra highly respectable Jewish people. We've got rape and we've got adultery in the story. Fascinating. And he's not, you know, David, the father of Solomon, by the wife of Uriah, if you know that story. It's not a pure line of pedigree that you'd be entirely proud of, but Matthew wants to tell us this is the real world. This is Jesus' ancestry. But he begins with half a chapter of genealogy, lots of names, very rarely read out in church, which is a shame because it's telling us something, it's making a point. This is what Matthew is doing. He's showing that Jesus is Jewish and that he is the Jewish Messiah, and he's descended from Abraham, the founder of the nation, and he's descended from David, the great king, who had promised to him that one of his descendants would rule forever. Matthew's building that picture up the whole time. Then we get into the birth of Jesus and things that are the visit of the wise men and the murder of the innocents, which is at the hands of Herod, who's the king of the Jews, sort of. Matthew pulls no punches about what's going on and about how corrupt and unbelieving Israel had become, even though they claimed faith. And he talks about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law and all the rest of it. Matthew is very well aware of the religious structure of his day, but he's aware that it's not doing the job, not bringing people into relationship with God. And he's presenting Jesus as a replacement in lots of ways. And you can see hints in Matthew that he's presenting Jesus as in some ways the new Moses. When we get to the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, Jesus is quoting commands given through Moses. You've heard it said, but I say to you. He's showing Jesus as the new lawgiver. Very Jewish, but Jesus as almost a replacement for Moses, a fulfillment of Moses, a fulfillment of David, the great king. But change is afoot for the chosen people, the people of God, God's holy nation. They're no longer the people of Abraham and David. They're going to be the people of Jesus from now on. And that's part of Matthew's message. Matthew's very strong on discipleship, and we've got this in the Sermon on the Mount, not least in chapters 5, 6, 7, in some of the teaching about the life of the church in chapter 18, in some of the teaching about going out with the message in chapter 10. So it's a lot of discipleship teaching, and it's important. It's all Jesus teaching, but the way Matthew's organizing it and the way Matthew is presenting and prioritizing it is very important. As you read through Matthew, there's much blessing to be had, but there's even more blessing to be had if you know the Old Testament well and see the links and connections. You don't need to know the Old Testament to understand what Matthew's doing in the way he presents the story of Jesus. But it's very powerful. He makes a fair bit of the 12 disciples and Jesus giving them authority. And I'm more than certain that is picking up from the 12 tribes of the Old Testament, which defined the Jews. Who are you a Jew? You're part of one of those 12 tribes, the descendants of the 12 brothers. And Matthew sees the 12 disciples as part of the story. It's a new Moses, it's a new Israel, it's renewed, redefined people of God. Matthew isn't just telling a story of Jesus, he's telling a story of both continuity and change in God's dealing with his people. The new covenant, the new relationship between God and his people, no longer based on Abraham, Moses, and David, though flowing from them and fulfilling them, but now based on Jesus, who replaces Abraham, Moses, and David. Matthew is strong on this. So Matthew talks about, quotes Jesus as saying that he's greater than big characters from the Old Testament. Greater than Solomon is here, says Jesus in Matthew. Greater than Jonah is here, Jonah the mission preacher. Greater than the temple is here. The temple is the heart of where Jewish people meet God and where their sins are forgiven, where the law is proclaimed and salvation is found. That's the temple. And Jesus says greater than the temple is here. Matthew quotes that. So he's picking up Old Testament and he's saying, it's all about Jesus, folks. It's all about Jesus. Matthew likes grouping things together. So chapter 13, you get a whole parable of, a whole chapter, a long chapter of different parables. They're parables of the kingdom, what the kingdom is like and how it's different from this world, significantly different. Other bits of Matthew you'll find elsewhere in the Gospels too, but presented in a different way. Matthew gives a big moment in chapter 16 to the encounter at the district of Caesarea Philippi, which is a center of pagan worship, the worship of Pan. And Jesus asks there, who do people say the Son of Man is? And this is the moment where Simon Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that's a huge hinge, a crunch moment in the story. Blessed are you, Simon, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. This is the beginning of a new thing entirely. I will build my church upon this rock. Peter means rock, the rock of the faith, the understanding that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. That is, he's the one promised in the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment of all God's promises. That's the rock. That is the basis on which he builds his church and his kingdom. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And that's really, really important in Matthew. Following that, Matthew, and you get the same idea in Mark and in Luke very clearly, but following that moment, Jesus begins to shift his emphasis, and from then on he's preparing them for his death and resurrection, which is probably about 6 months after that Caesarea Philippi event. We have the story of the Transfiguration and so on, but he insists there that it's Moses and Elijah who Jesus is meeting on the Mount of Transfiguration. Again, big Old Testament characters, that continuity with the Old Testament and the renewing and change from the Old Testament. Matthew is the one gospel which talks about the future church in a significant way. You've got some of that, particularly in chapter 18, with relationships within the church. And you've got further parables and stories and more teaching. And then you come to the story of the Passion, Jesus' suffering and death, and it's told in some detail with slightly different angles of detail from the others, but it's there clearly. But with bits of Jewishness, as Jesus breathes his last, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. He's really into the meaning of the temple. And in the temple, the Holy of Holies is the place where only the high priest can go. And that's where God lives. And the people are kept out by the holy curtain. And as Jesus dies, the curtain is torn from top to bottom. It's not a revolution, human beings at the bottom pulling it open. It's God from above ripping it apart. No separation between God and man anymore, because Jesus has died to bring us together, to reconcile and bring God and man into union. That's a Jewish thinking about what's happening at this point. The way of doing religion has changed. We all have direct access to God through Jesus and through his death in particular. Jesus is buried, and we get it. Clearly, there's Jewishness about that, and he rises from the dead, and that's wonderful. And then we don't get lots of resurrection appearances, but we do get this great commission at the end of chapter 28. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And remember, I'm with you always to the end of the age. The huge change, I suppose the huge change in Matthew's gospel, is that we have direct access to God. The curtain of the temple is torn. But then, this is for all people, not just the Jewish people, says Matthew, the Jewish writer. Read Matthew for yourself, get back into it. There's blessing upon blessing here. God bless you.